Fun begins already.
But I was walking into where our table is, and Jimmy Church grabs me and says, "Richard, we need to talk about this bombshell. I sent you the email this morning." Of course, I didn't read it. And they had a couple of guys who were recording the whole thing, but apparently the Pentagon this morning, or the news went out from the Pentagon spokesperson that Luis Elizondo never worked at ATIP. So, he wanted a reaction from me, and I said, well, okay, first of all, don't believe everything the Pentagon says, so let's wait a little bit of time on this before we rush to judgment. But it is startling. So, but I'm thinking there was the ATIP program. There were a number of other programs that were believed to have been in operation at the time during the time of that program and the different acronyms that exist. So there's opportunity for a lot of confusion. So I would just wait before people want to get the torches and pitchforks against Luis Elizondo. It's an odd thing, and I don't have any of the answers on it right now, so it's all new to me. So I figured some of you must have heard about it. Glad to see Michael Stroud here, by the way. That's always an honor. One of the very best research.
You're the man, Richard. You're the man.
Well, thank you, but you're the man. So Michael is an absolute top-rate expert on aircraft and aerospace, and but beyond that, UFO phenomenon. I've been maybe sometime. Hopefully, you can. Am I waiting for Robert Perella? Introduce me.
I think he already kind of did and then left.
That's all you get,
But
Richard.
you missed it.
That's all you get.
Probably. Well, I don't want to cut him out because he was supposed to introduce me yesterday. And Jimmy Church jumped in and did that. So if he wants to come back, and actually they may need to for their
video,
recording
they
video
did that,
purposes.
still got 4 minutes.
Do I need to wait for Robert?
No, you don't. Give me maybe 5 to 6 seconds I can start, and then you want to start. Yeah, thank
Sure.
you.
Great. Just let me know when you are ready, okay? Wow, I have a laser pointer.
Boyfriend Hancock could have sure used
Okay.
that.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
All right, so we're rolling, and well, thank you. This is actually, I didn't expect anyone to be here. I thought I would be here. It's really great to be here with you, and so I'm just trying to think if there's any prelim things I want to discuss before we jump into this. Probably not. If there is, I'll just do it as we go. This is supposed to be up to 2 hours, so we may go for 2 hours for all I know. Yesterday I went much shorter than I thought I would, which is a first ever in any of my lectures. I don't think that'll happen this time. I've titled this The New Face of Disclosure. I called it this actually a number of months ago when I came up with the title. If I were to call it anything now, I would rename it Controlled Disclosure. It's the phrase that I've been using lately. It is quite interesting when you think about the era that we're in these last 18 months particularly. It's very different. We're in a very different place publicly, at least in terms of the UFO subject, than where we were, prior to, let's say, October 2017, prior to the announcement of TTSA's initiative. I think that's, in retrospect, it seems to me, maybe some of you have different opinions on this, that we actually moved into a new era. Wasn't quite clear at the time, but I don't know, I'm willing to think maybe we are. So let me see what we've got here. Oh yeah, well 10 years ago I wrote this book, After Disclosure, and it was the first attempt to do I think to this day, the only book-length attempt to visualize how UFO secrecy might end. How it might end, and then the big question, what would happen next? And I had a great co-author, Bryce Abel. He was the creator of the TV show Dark Skies back in the 90s, if some of you remember that. Bryce brought a really great element to this book. He screenwriter. He's skilled at that. So the book has a kind of liveliness that my other boring books don't have. So this is a very good read as opposed to the other ones. But what we try to do is sit down like a think tank would, actually, and ask ourselves, how might UFO secrecy end? And if it does end, how would it really transform our world? And it was a great exercise for us, to be honest. It really forced us to think through things. At the end of the book, I came to my own conclusion, which was I feel like I understand why there's a lot of secrecy on UFOs. Not that I didn't before, but when you think through the changes that would occur in our society as a result of the ending of this great secret, which is a great secret indeed, a lot of things seemed, at least to me, to us, to be opening up and changing in our society. Political blowback. If UFO secrecy were to end, if the statement from the president were to come out there and say it's real, that's what everyone's been waiting for, and that's how we envisioned it. Some sighting, some unexplained event happened that would force the hand of the secret keepers, where they would be unable to maintain the secrecy any longer. That was the best. Did you want to introduce me, Robert?
You're on at 2:35.
I didn't know. So, is it, hey, ladies and gentlemen, Robert, we're on.
With these other speakers, right? And you go, oh, wait a minute, I want to talk to you. I'm like, okay, what time is it? And I want Earth coordinates time. You want to go on now? We should.
We actually started.
We already started.
That's what happens when you go on early. You got extra value. Great, you got 6 more minutes. Okay. Let me tell you really quickly. Of course, you're in the preeminent conference of its kind, Contact in the Desert. This is really the biggest event of its kind in the world, both domestically and internationally. There's really nothing like it. And say it's the UFO, the Woodstock of UFOs, they weren't kidding. Our good friend Richard Dolan. What a charmer this one is. I love him. There's something that everyone loves about him. Why? Because he's the real thing. There's not a lot of bling and flash and all this and everything. You can count on his silence, which is really extraordinary. He also has a master's in history, so he knows where we're coming from. He, of course, is host of the Sci-Fi Investigates for the Sci-Fi Channel, but I find him so amazing. All I can say is startling and intelligent. This is Richard Dolan.
That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. Seriously, thank you, Robert. So Sci-Fi Investigates, just letting you know, it was 2006. It was a great show. I did that show with Boston Rob Mariano. Anyone know Boston Rob from Survivor? I worked with him on that show. It was crazy. I'll just say this. So we started out the show truly, absolutely hating each other. Like, to the depths of each of our souls. Like, I thought, this guy's a complete loser. And he thought, this guy's a complete loser. And by the end of the show, we were like buddies crying, I'm gonna miss you. So I enjoyed doing the show, actually. So back to what I was talking about with this disclosure, the best way I could envision the end of UFO secrecy, at that time I wrote that book, which was 2009, and then we revised it in 2010, was that that the truth would come out of the cold, dead fingers of the elite, just ripped away from them as unwilling as could be. And the reason is that I've just seen, and I do still see, too much change coming about as a result of a true ending of UFO secrecy. A secrecy that has corrupted, really, our major institutions, our political institutions, our academic institutions, our scientific institutions, our media, clearly, all of which have been complicit. And it's not that all the people in academia are complicit, obviously they're not, but what will happen is that when there's an open, honest analysis of the structure of secrecy, it's going to be clear that there have been watchdogs placed in all of those institutions to keep everyone in line, and those institutions have been just totally corrupted. So that was one major area that we wrote about, that I wrote about. I focused on that one. The blowback. And there are other transformative elements of disclosure that Bryce and I really thought about. Cultural changes, scientific changes, the opening up of some of the secrets. I mean, my reasoning had always been, if this were to come out, that these objects are real and that they're able to do instant acceleration, then you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that they're not using rocket fuel or jet fuel to do what they do. They're using something unusual, that there's a new way to propel an object like this, a new form of propulsion and energy. And my reasoning was always, well, if that comes out, that will propel us into the next energy era. Free energy of some sort or another, whatever that would be, whether it's 0 point or something else. So my feeling was the end of UFO secrecy would be an absolutely revolutionary act. And for that reason, I've never seen a motivation ever coming from the secret keepers to give this secret up. And so with after disclosure, and this was really my lead in this element of the book, my feeling was always the secret would come out by accident. That we're in an era where we're all talking to each other, there's a lot of communication, the web. This was before the mass amount of censorship and deplatforming that we're seeing now. 10 years ago, I guess I would say, I don't know if I would have predicted that happening at this time, but it is happening, so that's changing the equation. But at the time I thought, well, we're sharing information, and there's WikiLeaks, which was around back then, and other hacktivist types of groups, and I just thought this is going to come out, one way or another, because this is the era we're in, and it's going to force a startling event to be recorded or leaked, and the power elites are going to have to scramble, and an avalanche will happen. So that's what it was. And now it's 10 years later, and actually, let me just go on. So after that book came out, I gave a lot of lectures on this. These are slides from some of my earlier lectures, and I did them variously in 2010, 2012, 2013, where I've continued to refine what I thought, like how disclosure would go down. So after disclosure came out, I started to theorize, well, there's probably a variety of ways that this is going to happen. It's not just going to be necessarily one big sighting and they can't contain it and it gets out. Because after all, on YouTube, if you look for UFO sightings for this year on YouTube, I don't know how many you'll get, but it's more than, the quantity is not the problem. 50, 60 years ago, the quantity was the problem. Having access to data was a problem then. It's not the problem now. Now we're just flooded with information. And so another UFO video, we're like, big deal, who cares? Even if it's legit. Some of them I think are definitely legit. We can't analyze them all. So it occurred to me that it's not a big sighting that's going to necessarily break this open. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. And I started thinking, we're living in an era that I've called, I think since 2002, 2003, an era of invisible fascism. That was a nice little phrase I coined back then. I thought to myself, could you live in a fascist society and not know it? That was my idea. This is in the early war on terror, in the Bush years, and my kids were little back then, and I realized, well, they're oblivious to the horrible things that are happening. Not just my kids, a lot of adults were not really aware, I thought. And, my feeling was, well, we just basically torched the Constitution in a lot of ways, and people don't really seem to be aware. So can you be living, we think of fascism, we think of Hitler, Mussolini, and the troops marching down the street, in-your-face fascism. Back in the 30s, it was in your face. But I thought, does it have to be in your face? Does it have to be the cult of a leader, as we've always been taught? And really, it doesn't. Fascism doesn't have to be a leader cult, not at all. It could be a cult of a bureaucracy, it could be the cult of a state, it could be the cult of law. And I thought you could live in a fascist society and not know it. Of course you could. So I thought it's invisible. So ever since then I thought, well, what if disclosure happens in such a way that, this is me in like 2011, 2012, that we're under such total brainwashed control, mind control, that the secret keepers then feel confident enough that they can maintain total control of the narrative and roll out disclosure in the way that they see fit. So I was talking about that for many, many years. And I called it, at various times, fascist disclosure. Kind of a strong term for it, but there you go. But I thought, well, there's still other ways that this can come out. So eventually ended up on premature disclosure. Sounds a little cheeky, but that's the word I came up with. Disclosure before they're ready for it. And that was the main scenario that I wrote about in after disclosure. Something unexpected that catches the secret keepers off guard. And that would cause maybe a meltdown or a breakdown of social order, possibly. And then I was very idealistic and utopian even in thinking of people-driven disclosure. And I still believe like this would be a really great way to do it. That is, the UFO phenomenon as a culture making enough inroads to transform the culture from the bottom up and to cause enough pressure on the hierarchy, let's say, to drive this movement. And that I always envisioned as a much longer term process, but one that really does have, or would have, genuine possibility given enough time for change. So through the last decade, I guess you could say, I've tried to mull through like different ways that a disclosure could happen. This is the last slide that I borrowed from previous lectures. So I think it still applies. I have been thinking for a while that we're in a race. And the race is between us and those people who are our would-be masters of the universe. That is, the people who basically own everything in this world. Us versus our elites. And the race is to see who gets to the finish line first. And the finish line is, if they get to the finish line first, that means they obtain total control over the internet, total centralization of global power, basically. We see it happening all around us. If we get to the finish line first, it would mean we achieve certain kinds of breakthroughs. One of the things I was thinking was 3D printing and file sharing. So combine the Pirate Bay with some next generation 3D print design of an energy saving device or a free energy device. One of my favorite little fantasies that I kept cooking up was some smart person in some part of the world would come up with a very effective free energy device. I got this idea because I did a free energy conference back in, I think, 2013, and I met a lot of these people, very, very smart people. And I don't know that all of their ideas were right, but I don't think they were all wrong. So my feeling was someone is going to come up with a little device, yay big, that will generate your energy for you, and you can flip the bird to your utility company and go off the grid and have some independence before it becomes illegal. So someone would upload the CAD design of it on the next generation Pirate Bay, and you could download it on your next generation 3D printer. So I cook all these ideas up in my head, and I thought, that one could actually happen. It could happen. Hasn't happened yet. That I know of. But of course, what was also going on at the same time was, as we learned through WikiLeaks, this is during the Obama years, they were pushing through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which one of the features of the TPP was that it really consolidated, let's say, would consolidate corporate control over a lot of intellectual property, so that basically some smart person in Vietnam, they might develop a free energy device, but it would break classified patent laws in the US and it would never go. And it would also, they'd be able to just block all this type of file sharing through different laws and so forth. So for me, the race was or another part of the race would be we actually achieve a breakthrough in siphoning out some government document on UFOs. That's even better than the FOIA documents that we have today. I thought it's possible. Before everything gets shut down completely and controlled completely, we might be able to achieve breakthroughs in various ways. So, I don't think that that's invalid to this day. The way I wrote it out on the slide is there's certain problems and solutions from the point of view of the elite. Problem number one is that we've had a greater amount of social awareness sparked by the web. This isn't the 1980s anymore, where you could turn on the TV and watch, what was that show? Full House. Remember that one? Or some of the other ridiculous shows of that era that were possible because there was no web. You know, we had reached the nadir of culture in the 1980s in a lot of ways, at least for television. It was the worst. And it was because no one had alternatives. So it was run by a small little clique, and they just cranked out worse and worse crap for us to ingest over the years. But then came the web, and we realized we have other options than watching terrible television, and that transformed a lot of things going on in our world. So, and it also transformed a lot of our ability to talk to each other and organize and deal with a lot of issues that are important in this world. That's the problem from the point of view of those individuals who want to continually control narratives. And what we've been seeing, and I was calling this 10 years ago, and it's definitely happening now, is that the web is increasingly turning into your TV. I have a slide up ahead here, but I'll just tell you about it. If you do a search, I mentioned this yesterday, I think. If you do a search on UFO on YouTube, so you go to YouTube, and you could be signed in under your account or not, doesn't matter. Type in UFO, and you will get page after page after page after page of CNN, BBC, Fox, CNN, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, NBC, page after page, same pictures. Some of those YouTube channels will have, they may have 100,000 views, they may have 3,000 views. And there are all these millions, well, many alternative non-corporate establishment sites, like mine and like many others, that have vastly more views, but they're weeded out of the search algorithms.
They did that, what, 3 weeks ago, was it?
It's been even for more than that, I believe.
But like really hardcore.
Possibly, yes.
Yeah.
So the only way that the established sources of news can win is by cheating. That's the only recourse they have, by rigging the search game. And don't believe me, test it yourself, you will see. So in other words, they're turning, so it's like, why bother going to YouTube if you're going to do a search? Just turn on your television, you'll get CNN or you'll get Fox, like big deal. We in theory, we like to go to YouTube because we get a little bit more than corporate establishment television, but they're turning the web into TV, slowly but surely. And then, another problem is that we're sharing new ideas in tech that will violate corporate IP laws and things like that, intellectual property. So the solution is you create international laws and you stop file sharing. Another problem is fewer and fewer good jobs. And, people are getting restless. We're seeing it slowly happening. And we're only at the very beginning of this. So the solution to that, the only real solution as I see it is you create a police state. Not give more jobs. I don't think that's going to be possible. I gave a whole lecture yesterday as to why I don't think that will happen. It was a depressing lecture. Robots will become our masters. Not really our masters, they're just going to take our jobs away. So, anyway, these are things where I've been at over the last few years. And then what we're seeing, though, this is something I did not fully foresee 10 years ago, is the rebranding effort. So we saw this was Hillary with Jimmy Kimmel in 2016, I think that was. This was a very important moment in all of what I'm talking about here. Because he asked Bill Clinton, he asked Barack Obama about UFOs as well, and then he gets Hillary on, and he says the same thing. What's the story with UFOs? And she says, well, we don't call them UFOs, we call them UAP. And then she kind of slightly mispronounced unidentified aerial phenomena, if you listen carefully. So she was obviously being trained to say that. So the whole thing about introducing the phrase UAP to the general population, that's obviously what this was about. And I think someone who I was just talking to not long ago who was quite experienced with how these TV shows, someone, it was Jimmy Church, I was arguing with Jimmy about these types of talk shows. And he actually, he lived in LA for many, many years, of course, and used to hang out at a lot of these studios. And he was telling me, when you have a big shot guest, like Hillary Clinton, go on the show, the preparation's made weeks in advance. Everything is very carefully managed. And certainly that's got to include all the questions. So these are not spontaneous questions. These are clearly delineated questions for a reason. And I think we're starting to see the reason now. UAP is a concept that was to be introduced. Why? Well, I will get into that. But it's a rebranding process. And it's not that UAP is a bad phrase, by the way. It was invented, I believe, by Dr. Richard Haynes around 1980. Richard Haynes is still around. He's an excellent researcher, creator of the organization NARCAP, which focuses on aviation encounters with UFOs. And he's a very serious researcher, and he's done great work. And he coined this phrase almost 40 years ago as a way, I assume, to be a little more precise about what this phenomenon is. And UAP did get cachet within the military community. It was used extensively in the Condon report by the UK military in the 1990s, and it's obviously become a preferred term. So Hillary, though, is bringing that phrase in with Jimmy Kimmel in 2016. So I want to, with you here, reevaluate disclosure. I have a little subtitle, Waiting for the Explosion That May Never Come. Well, I think there will be an explosion. I think there's a lot happening, but what's happening is different than what I might have predicted 10 years ago. This is very interesting. So it's what I'm calling controlled disclosure. So I believe this cover-up has an expiration date. In other words, we're still in a very topsy-turvy era, despite the fact that there's a ever-increasing amount of control being placed over the web in so many ways. The web is still, when you really get down to it, it's still pretty much a wide open place, and there's a lot of information being shared there, obviously. And the advent of the web and of the internet has had a tremendous effect on the UFO subject in general. And it's, okay, you probably don't need to take any more of those, right? It's okay. Just threw me a little bit there. It's okay. It's fine. So I think what's happening is that things are speeding up, and my best guess at this time is that, and I don't know their names, but those people who I think have more information on this secret than anyone else have probably made a decision, which is that we're not going to be able to contain this forever. It's not going to be possible. So what we're going to do is we're going to roll out some information and maintain as much control over it as possible. And that's what I think is going on here. So what did I say? Oh, well, what I just said before is what I'm saying here. So the internet has brought great freedom in inquiry and expressions, transformed a lot of things, including the cover-up. So, oh yes, let me break this point down. Therefore, to bring about a controlled disclosure, the internet has to change. Now, the internet is changing not simply because we need to roll out UFO disclosure. It's changing for other very profound reasons, but this is factoring into it. So what it's meant is the purge. And, I'm not here to complain, but I get finger wrapped by YouTube every single week now with whatever it is I create. And I don't create anything that's questionable in my view. Everything that we put on our channel is respectful. Everything that we put on our channel is careful and truthful. And we don't use bad language. I say damn once in a while. That's as bad as it gets. I don't think that's... But whatever we end up putting up, YouTube, they don't ban it. They just demonetize. That's stage one of it. So it's like their way of disincentivizing you for doing any of this type of stuff. And I just think, what did I say this time? I talked about the revision of the Navy UAP guidelines, which we're going to talk about here a little bit. And they dinged me for that, and I thought, why? They talked about it, it's in the news. Like, I'm just repeating what the New York Times and other people have said. So this is what I'm talking about. So this is a typing of UFO. This is from my phone, screenshot. And I just did this the other day. So this is before last night's Unidentified show premiere, so that might appear in the search now, but that's also corporate. But I'll just read. So the top one is ABC News, New York Post. And then there's the movie UFO starring Gillian Anderson. And then RT America made it in there. That shocked me that RT made the top list of UFO. And then Sony Pictures, and then Sony Pictures, and then Sony Pictures, 3 in a row. CBS, another movie thing. Channel 4 News, that's British. CNN, CBS, only in El Paso, a regional. NBC, Fox, Global News, Fox, CTV. I don't know what CTV is. That's Canadian, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. CNN, Fox, New York Post, ABC, Global News, ABC, Fox. That's the first 4 pages on my phones.
And they're old, too.
Yeah, a lot of them are really old, right.
That
And-
used to be used security and several other
Absolutely.
very high-ranking channels a month and a half ago.
all been changed, right?
All been changed.
And a lot of these have like, how many views? I'm looking. Some of them have a lot. 4,000 views is one. 615,000, that's decent. 700,000. Some of them are pretty high, but others are low. Yeah, and they're old, exactly. So I did this, I think 2 days ago with my phone.
Did you filter it?
No filters whatsoever, just UFO. That's it. And I think I was signed out on this one, but anyway, it doesn't make any difference. I've tried it. So my point is simply that we're seeing a change in the algorithms, before I move on to that, and it's part of controlling this narrative, obviously. So if you search in UFO, you've got to become really good now when you do searches. You've got to be very, very astute, it seems to me, and it gets harder and harder than it was, certainly 5 years ago and certainly 1 year ago. Lots of big differences. So that's very concerning. So let me talk a little bit about what I guess we'll call the drip of disclosure back in 2000. And it's funny to think about this. When I was writing that book in the 90s, especially the first year or two, I actually almost didn't tell anybody I was writing a book on UFOs. It was like that embarrassing. I was like, don't look at me when I write. And the culture was different in the mid-90s when I was working on this. It came out in 2000, 2001. I remember starting to go to various events back then, and it's a different culture now. So what's happened in 20 years is we've had the web, we've had YouTube, we've had a lot of this information being shared by people. Do you realize that UFO subject was the first non-programming type of topic to make it to the old bulletin board system of the internet back in the 80s? In other words, the UFOs was the first substantive topic to help comprise the internet. But the earliest, this is before there was graphic user interface, before there were images, it was all text. So the earliest internet bulletin boards were all like tech programming type stuff. And then in 1986, I think it was January 86, a fellow named Jim Spicer opened up a UFO bulletin board. It was the first, and I believe it was the first non-tech subject matter to appear on what we now know as the internet. So that's 33 years ago. So UFOs, and what I'm saying is, have always been a very powerful cultural subject that people are definitely interested in, and has always been sort of kept away from them. And with the freedom of the web, of the internet, we have been able to explore that interest. And the exploration of that interest on the free web has forced inevitable changes from the more established culture. Certainly corporations that want to make money off of that interest in UFOs, and so we've seen changes in TV programming, increasingly opening up on that. So that's really been a big part of the story of the last generation, is how the web has allowed us to have the freedom to explore this subject that we're all interested in here. And in the last 20 years, I would say, with the 21st century, we've seen significant events that have happened. You know, I think of the various disclosure conferences, starting really with Stephen Greer's seminal one of 2001, and many that Steve Bassett organized, the X conferences, culminating in his Mondo week-long citizen hearing on disclosure. Michael, you were part of that, I believe, weren't you?
No.
You were not? Well, you should have been. He should have had you in there. That was a very kind of a big thing in my life. And then Robert Hastings did a very big press conference, James Fox with Leslie Kean, and I'm sure there were others. So that's interesting. And just in parallel track, we now know, or we're now told, that the ATIP organization was in existence from 2007 to 2012. One thing that we know is true is that even prior to the creation of ATIP, the Navy and the Air Force and the other branches of the military, the Army, all had protocols for dealing with UFOs, all of them. Just recently we were watching a documentary released on YouTube, the USS Nimitz, by their channel, and it's very interesting, and actually got into a lot of detail about, among other things, the secrecy involved in the aftermath of the Tic Tac UFO encounter, and how all of the data from that event were confiscated. So that's 2004, and that's several years before the creation of ATIP, so you might want to ask yourself, okay, what's the organization that was taking all of that UFO data? So anyway, let me continue here. Things really started picking up in our culture. I would say that, you know, there's the Hillary Clinton moment with Jimmy Kimmel in 2016, and in 2017 a lot happened. Robert Bigelow does his appearance on 60 Minutes, where he's saying they're everywhere, they're already here. The person interviewing him was trying to get him to almost feel embarrassed about his admission about UFOs, and he just wouldn't have any of it. And Bigelow was a very brilliant man. You really can't intimidate him, it seems to me. And he was very straightforward about it, didn't care what his interviewer might have thought, and he makes this very straightforward statement. It's kind of important. That was May of 2017, just 2 years ago. And a couple of months after that, of course, was the very big announcement. It was a big event. The formation, or the public announcement of TTSA as a public company. There's Tom DeLonge in the front there. And you've got the TTSA team. There's Jim Simivan, Hal Puthoff, and Luis Elizondo, and Christopher Mellon, and the gentleman on the far right, I'm not remembering his name. But these are impressive people from intelligence, defense. The only one that I personally know, I've met, is Puthoff, but they're all quite public, and a lot of researchers have talked with many of them. And the thing about that is, it's easy to forget these things in retrospect, but this was probably the first moment in recent history where that large number of, let's say, impressive former government and intelligence officials were willing to go publicly to make a statement like this, that the military has been investigating UFOs, that our military's had encounters with these objects that have utterly baffled us, and we don't know how to explain it. It's not the first time high-level officials have talked about this, but this was kind of an important moment here. And it was obviously a very ambitious project, fronted by Tom DeLonge of Blink-182. And it got a lot of attention. Got a lot of people right off the bat criticizing them as an intelligence operation. And you hear that to this day. And I do and don't agree with it. I mostly don't agree with it. I'll come back to this, but I would just say I think that everyone's got motivations for doing everything, and these people are no exceptions. But it's also pretty clear to me that many of them are genuinely committed to getting this information out. And I know for an absolute fact that that's the case with Putoff. And I believe it's the case with a number of these other people. They believe in it. They also feel constrained and have felt constrained for many years by secrecy protocols. They're also, I have no doubt, interested in capitalizing to whatever extent they can on their situation. And my attitude is, why not? I mean, it's not a crime. As long as you're providing us with useful information that benefits us, that's the way that would work, in my opinion. But in terms of providing disinformation, well, they did come out with some pretty bad stumbles, let's face it. Having a picture of a Mylar balloon as a UFO that the Navy supposedly was encountering was a really big gaffe. Totally avoidable, and they shouldn't have done it. DeLong's interview with Joe Rogan, let's just say less than ideal. That was not his best moment. So there were a lot of things that went wrong with how TTSA comported itself publicly, surrounding these people. Only 2 months after that, we get the big articles, 2 of them that appear in the New York Times, Politico, and Washington Post even. Washington Post always was the most snarky, skeptic debunking of all of the American news media on this subject. At least, I mean, if you go back through the last decade and a half, the number of snarky UFO pieces they wrote is just off the charts. New York Times comes in at least not better than second place, but they've had a lot. And then suddenly you have this big turnaround. Leslie Kean, along with 2 other journalists, write, let's say, pretty good articles on UFOs. The fact that they appeared in the New York Times is really key. And there was new information in these articles. I don't think it was all true information. There was some misleading information in these articles. One of the things that they definitely soft pedaled, but eventually did get some attention, was the fact that materials were obtained and being studied by Bigelow Aerospace from alleged crash UFOs. That was an interesting little tidbit. That was the most interesting thing to me. For years and years, not only do UFO believers would we get laughed at and dismissed, but the whole idea of crash retrieval was just outrageous. How could you possibly believe that? And here's the New York Times writing in one little paragraph way down near the bottom of the article that, oh yes, well there's materials allegedly, they said, from these objects being studied or being stored in warehouses. And they used the phrase, I think, unusual metal alloys. That was a little bit deceptive because actually they were talking about these metamaterials. More on that in a moment. That they're extraterrestrial. They were very careful to say that. Well, we don't know that they're extraterrestrial. This is all part of the rebranding. But at least saying that this is apparently real and our military pilots have been struggling to deal with it. Of course, the story of the Tic Tac UFO, I think, is very well known, but it's still quite remarkable. Here's an object that was tracked for several weeks off the southern coast of California, where, and then finally they have an opportunity to send a couple of FA-18 Super Hornets to investigate. And, Fravor was the first one to be talking about this, and he talked repeatedly about how he finally saw the object down by the surface of the water. And he goes down in a spiral to meet it. It's spiraling opposite him, and then it comes and shoots off and is gone out of sight within 2 seconds. He had said perfect visibility of 10 miles, practical visibility of 50 miles. So analysis that I think had to be from Bigelow's subcontracting of the ATIP program, where they're doing an analysis of these objects that were under study. And I'll just read a little bit of this to you. This came out about a year ago, actually. It seems so long ago that this came out, actually. And I remember when it did, and I thought, this is actually very significant information. Among the key findings in the report, the anomalous aerial vehicle is not something that belongs to the U.S. or any other nation. It was so advanced it rendered U.S. capabilities ineffective. It's a very straightforward statement. When this came out, there were a lot of analysts saying, well, this is obviously not a U.S. Defense Department memo. It's not written in the right format. No, apparently not. It was just written by the subcontractor, but it's still legit. And then going on saying it shows velocities far greater than anything known to exist, and it could turn itself invisible both to radar and the human eye. Essentially, it was undetectable. This is the type of information. It just became public. Now, how public is another question. It became very public to those of us who like to follow the UFO subject, but I don't think it had much of a broader impact. But this is a very, very important thing, and this is a little bit more of the analysis that they discussed in bullet points. Advanced aerodynamic performance with no visible control surfaces, no visible means to generate lift. This is all standard stuff that we've been hearing for 70 years. You know, if you go back into some declassified reports from the 1940s, 1950s, they use a lot of history as being siphoned out of the phenomenon. I feel that that's a significant thing. In June of 2018, something even less known, but very important in my view, occurred. This is Hal Puthoff's speech for the Society of Scientific Exploration in conjunction with the International Remote Viewing Association. Yeah, I've been very lucky. I've had on and off conversations with Hal Puthoff for many years now, and in my view, he's someone always worth listening to. He never tells you everything you want to know, but the little things he tells you are always, you want to hang on to them. So he gives a lecture. This is on video. If you spend $5, you can listen to the lecture. It's there's the site. I would encourage you. This is important. During this lecture, he talks about a number of things, but he talks about the fact that for many, many years he was constrained from talking about his research into the UFO subject, but that he was now allowed to do so. He didn't really say who gave him the permission. He talked about the fact that his organization, EarthTech, was and had been for some time studying this artifact right here, which he said it was believed to come from a crash retrieval of a UFO from the 1940s. I think is what he said. And he said, now look, we don't really have true provenance of this. We don't really know. He said, okay, so take that as it is. He said, however, the fact is we've had this for a long time and we have not been able to figure out, A, who made this, B, who could have made this. He said, because we can't get these tiny layers of bismuth and magnesium to bond the way this thing is bonded. We don't know how they did it. They're very, very fine layers. Incredibly fine. He said, see, we didn't know what this was for. Like, what was this? Like, what could it do? He said, only in the last, 2 years, 2 or 3 years, he said, have we started to have a clue. He said, one thing is that this appears to serve as what he called an excellent, and the material, I'm not going to focus on this so much in this lecture as tomorrow, but the physicist Jack Sarfati did his own follow-up on this analysis on a really interesting YouTube interview. Only about a half hour. It's one of those interviews where I paused and wrote notes, for the entire time through, so that I could actually understand them. Sarfati was one of those hippie physicists of the 60s and early 70s, who was one of the first people to investigate entanglement in physics. And he's a character. He's a very brilliant man. He and I went through a period where I think he absolutely hated me because I don't think he liked my... And what he argues, essentially, is that, just like what Puthoff was saying, is that the materials of the object are key. And I think has been actually at least overlooked by a lot of people. You know, we tend to think, what's the engine? How does it do this? But it's the science, the material science of the skin as well that apparently is very, very important. in allowing these things to do what they do. And what Sarfati was saying is that at the microscopic level, the construction of these things, he says that they appear to be engineered at the angstrom level. Now, to put that in perspective, I did a search of metamaterials manufacturing. So what is a metamaterial, first of all? Metamaterial is a very highly engineered material at a microscopic level with, I guess, typically what's called a lattice-like structure. So it's very complex, and there's a lot of different, probably an almost infinite number of variations of how it could be put together.